Good afternoon. A warm welcome to all and thank you for joining us today. My name is Martina Wojtkova. I'm the Director of NatSen's Policy Research Centre, and it is my pleasure to chair today's event on promoting active travel, lessons learned from public engagement on low traffic neighbourhoods. Today's event explores the findings and shares recommendations from a study commissioned by the European Climate Foundation and conducted by NatSen Centre for Deliberative Research. The study involved a series of deliberative workshops that took part last summer and explored residents' experiences following the introduction of low traffic neighbourhood schemes in 2020. It explored how consensus on implementation can be built in order to produce clear recommendations to inform future implementation of low traffic neighbourhoods. We will hear three presentations today, outlining a background overview on low traffic neighbourhoods, the research findings from the workshops, and a participant point of view from the workshops. After the presentations, I will invite our respondents to share early insights on the report findings, followed by a Q&A session. You can submit your questions for the Q&A sessions throughout the event using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This leaves me with the pleasure to welcome and introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Ollie Lord. He is part of the Clean Cities campaign and a former city official and transport planner. He has led on work to reduce harmful emissions from vehicles, such as the London's ultra low emission zone and zero emissions vehicle strategy. Our second speaker is Ella Gascott. She's a senior researcher in NatSen Centre for Deliberative Research. And during her time at NatSen, Ella has facilitated deliberative discussions on topics such as sustainable energy, gender equality, and post-Brexit policymaking. And as mentioned, our third speaker is a participant from the workshops, and I will introduce that speaker when we get to that point. So without much further ado, welcome Ollie, welcome Ella, welcome everyone, and over to you, Ollie.
Thanks, Martina. Hi, everyone. So I was invited to present to the workshops that create the outcome of today's findings, to set the context really for low traffic neighbourhoods. So I will just go to present this. Here we go. So to start with, really, low traffic neighbourhoods were actually originally conceived back in the 1970s. So they've been around for some time. They might not have been called the title we give it today, but this was seen as an affordable and efficient way to reduce congestion in urban areas. And the types of measures that we see introduced in low traffic neighbourhoods piece by piece have actually been applied for quite a substantial amount of time. But this wholesale approach was first seen more recently in parts of London in 2014 in Waltham Forest as an example. And in 2020, we actually saw the government introduce a brand new active travel fund for local authorities in response to the COVID pandemic. And the focus there was on devising more of these schemes and assessing them with a view to making them permanent, so that we actually avoided a car-led recovery from the pandemic in our urban areas. And how a low traffic neighbourhood effectively works is it earmarks a particular area and starts to introduce separate measures that add up, so the parts make up more. So you actually have quite a comprehensive network of measures that start to reduce traffic in the given area. So for example, you would have a closure to a street with timed or restricted access that just enable businesses to have some loading first thing in the morning, but otherwise it would have no traffic on it. And you would start to assess the entry points into that area so that you actually reduce the amount of traffic that is allowed to go across the neighborhood, and actually you can just have entry and exit. And here's an example of how some of these measures look. Some of them are much more prettier than others. I'm sure you'll all agree, and some of them more temporary than others. But you can start to understand how these types of measures build up for a whole neighborhood. So you can only access the street to the top left, for example, by cycling or walking or wheeling. And on the right there, it's actually just changing how people access it in certain directions. And these are actually quite similar interventions to what we have seen by local authorities around schools as well. For example, car-free school streets that are introduced at certain times of day to make it safer and to improve the air quality around schools when kids are being dropped off. So why act now? Well, the big question, well, the big theme, I suppose, of all this is that if we can get the policy right, we can really live healthier lives. And here's an example that we often bring up around how we had the Clean Air Act, which actually got rid of power generation in cities and actually helped to clean up the air and actually transform those areas. And also, of course, the government has declared a climate emergency. So there is a big impetus to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But when we looked at the transport sector, which actually was responsible for almost a third, transport emissions have been broadly flat for the last 30 years. So even though other sectors have declined quite significantly. So there is definitely a need to act for climate change, but also for air pollution. And I could talk about particulate matter, which is the really tiny particles that can enter the bloodstream. An example there is on the right, a graphic image just before you have your dinner. If you see the fried egg in the bottom right-hand corner, the little spots in that egg is actually particulate matter, which are toxic particles that have entered a child's sputum. And the levels of particulate matter are significantly high in the UK, not just the UK. Many other countries suffer from this, not meeting World Health Organization limits. And there's actually no safe limit, really, a lot of scientists advocate. In addition to that, we have a really significant problem, especially in Europe, from nitrogen dioxide, which is a harmful gas, transparent, you can't see it, it causes severe respiratory problems. And actually diesel vehicles are a big dominant source of that. And air pollution also affects our health. It also affects marginalized communities the most as well. When we map emergency asthma admissions against areas of deprivation, for example, we start to see quite significant correlations. But we mustn't forget noise pollution as well. Here's an example in London where we see actually a lot of the city is affected by noise levels that breach the World Health Organization guidelines and costs, the health impacts are costing the NHS and society billions per year. And in addition to that, many of you will be also aware of the extent of flooding that we suffer from in the UK as well. And the more we kind of pave over driveways, the more we reduce the availability of rainwater to run off on our streets. We are also seeing increasing traffic on smaller roads throughout the country and especially in urban areas. So here's an example from London, but also the West Midlands. This is not just a phenomenon in the capital. Minor roads, the orange line shows you how much traffic has actually been increasing on those roads compared to, for example, the motorways. And there are lots of policies in place now to address all these challenges. Got a clean air strategy from the government, decarbonisation strategy, and then also the cities that we were focused in on this project, Birmingham and London, both have significant transport plans. And alongside that, it's about investing in public transport. For example, the bus back better strategy that the government has introduced to try and get more people onto the bus. Related to that are the clean air zones as well. So I suppose the point I'm making here is that the introduction of low traffic neighbourhoods should not be standalone. They should be part of a big package of measures to try and get people out of private cars and reduce their car use and become less dependent on them and enable them to take their journeys by other means. But of course, we also need to control the most polluting vehicles at the same time. There's obviously a big rollout for electric vehicles, and especially you can see the extent of charge points that are now being introduced in the UK there from that screenshot I provided from ZapMap. But all this technology solutions and encouraging cleaner vehicles is just part of the solution. We've heard from our Secretary of State for Transport that even look on pre-pandemic trends where road traffic is predicted to grow by 22% by 2035. And a lot of that is in cities where it's really difficult to build new roads, which of course, putting aside the health impacts of doing that, and also where it affects a lot of disadvantaged communities. So the aim from the national government is for 50% of all journeys in our towns and cities to be cycled or walked by 2030. And that's around encouraging more cycle lanes, encouraging healthier ways of getting to school, slower speed limits where they can reduce road casualties, and introducing pedestrian and cycle zones and what we call modal filters. So where you close certain roads and you restrict certain access to motor traffic, but you enable healthier ways of getting around. So the potential for all this, well, when we actually look at the figures, around 43% of all urban and town journeys in England and Wales are under 2 miles, which is quite phenomenal when you think about the potential there for actually cycling, for example, or even walking or wheeling around, or e-scootering would be another option. And in London alone, children driven to school make up 25% of the weekday morning peak car trips, and that gets higher depending where you are in the city. So we've seen a rollout of low traffic neighbourhoods, and I was invited to just add some commentary about how this has been perceived and how it's going. It makes driving a little less convenient in the local area, so people start to reconsider those shorter journeys, and it helps to reduce those popular shortcuts that are otherwise less affectionately known as rat runs. It helps to reduce harmful emissions and quieter and more peaceful streets. So there's a lot of potential there that low traffic neighbourhoods can create. The route to implementation has, to some extent, had some criticism, because the way that this was introduced through an emergency active travel fund, there was less opportunity to actually introduce these in the more traditional sense, in terms of having a full consultation period prior to introducing a measure. But that also sometimes has benefits. When you bring in an experimental traffic order, people start to actually experience what is actually being proposed as well, and that can actually shift minds and attitudes. So they were funded on an emergency footing, and there have been some concerns that councils are more paying lip service to the idea rather than them being genuine trials. And of course, there are really important issues to take into account around ensuring equality in the neighbourhoods. So how people with mobility impairments are able to access the neighbourhood if they are much more dependent on using a car, for example, like for example would be blue badge holders, where people nominate a vehicle to help them move around. And then also the equality of, well, if you're not inside that specific neighbourhood, then those residents inside, are they being asked to actually reduce their car use and actually to reduce their ownership and actually share vehicles more, so we create more space and they're playing their part as much as the people that do not live in the neighbourhood. And also we need to take into account essential services, so making sure that the fire brigade, for example, and the ambulance service can access the area, and ensuring there is no adverse impacts on any roads that surround the immediate area. I think also something else that needs to be considered as we roll these out in the future is the trends in mobility. So I mentioned e-scooters earlier, and thinking about how they could help to be incorporated into low traffic neighbourhoods as an option for residents. And there is also a phenomenal increase now in diesel vans on our streets, which are related to some extent related to home deliveries. So where more people are getting deliveries in their local neighbourhoods, how does that relate to restricting access for certain types of vehicles? And can we introduce other means and easy ways for people to receive those deliveries without there being an influx of new types of vehicles? So in summary, we know that cities need to address a lot of serious public health and climate concerns. There's a phenomenal amount of emissions produced, harmful emissions in the city. And we've also got this UK government target to aim for 50% of all journeys being cycled or walked by 2030. We've also seen this big increase in road traffic. So with the broad policies that we've got in place to address these challenges, low traffic neighbourhoods should be seen as part of the toolkit. But there are concerns. Does one size fit all? Is it easy to compare such local schemes with each other? And we have to ensure that there's an equitable rollout. So I hope you're going to enjoy today's session and hear the findings that NatSen have produced for you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Ollie, for the excellent introduction to low traffic neighbourhoods and the broader context within which these are implemented. Let me now hand over to Ella, who will talk to us about some of the findings from the research.
Thanks, Martina. I'll just share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see that okay. So I'm Ella. I'm a researcher at NatSen, and I worked on this deliberative project that we ran on low traffic neighbourhoods. So today I'm going to run through just a bit about the background to the research, and then I'm going to run through some of the key findings. So what participants thought about LTNs and their suggestions for implementing LTNs in the future. And then I'll just draw a couple of conclusions. So as Ollie just laid out in his presentation, we know that the speed of implementation of LTNs in 2020, combined with sometimes limited consultation, has led in some cases to a bit of a backlash. And the European Climate Foundation wanted to ensure that lessons were learned from this initial implementation, including what factors led to schemes being more or less successful, in order to inform future implementation of LTNs or similar schemes. So the central aim of the research was to understand how measures to promote active travel and shared and public transport as an alternative to private car use can be successfully implemented in ways that are acceptable to the public based on recent experiences of LTNs. So in order to achieve this, the research sought to understand the issues experienced when introducing LTN schemes in 2020 and explore the perspectives of different groups, explore how consensus on implementation can be built, and produce clear recommendations to inform the future, any future LTN implementation. So in order to address these questions, a deliberative approach was taken. So deliberative research focuses on uncovering people's attitudes after they've been provided with impartial evidence and good conditions to discuss the issues in question. And it differs to many traditional research methods, which aim to uncover people's existing views. So deliberative research can therefore be valuable for providing insight into attitudes to policy problems that are particularly contested and complex, such as LTNs. And this is really because it encourages participants to look at the topic in broad terms, receive and consider evidence across kind of different sides of the argument, have time to reflect, and deliberate in a group with people from different sides of the debate. So we began the research with a scoping phase where we assessed the broader LTN landscape through a literature review to identify the 3 case study areas which would form the focus of the deliberative work. The areas we identified were Lambeth and Wandsworth in London and Lozells in Birmingham. And all of these areas had implemented LTNs since May 2020 and had varied in terms of public perceptions towards them. After the scoping phase, we moved into the deliberative workshop phase, and we recruited around 30 participants from each of the case study areas. The participants were recruited through an independent recruitment agency and were chosen to ensure diversity in terms of a range of demographic characteristics and also perspectives on LTNs. And participants also received a thank you payment for taking part. The workshops took place in 3 stages. So the first stage involved holding 1 workshop in each of the 3 areas, and they involved both plenary and small group discussions and a presentation from an expert witness, who was Ollie, giving an overview of the debate on LTNs and sort of covering different sides of the issue. And Ollie presented the same evidence across all of the workshops to ensure that all the participants received the same information. So those 3 deliberative workshops generated a range of recommendations, and in stage 2, before the final workshop, the research team synthesized those recommendations into some overarching categories. And stage 3 then involved a final follow-up workshop where a sample of participants from across the 3 areas were able to come together to share and compare local experiences and agree recommendations using those overarching categories that we'd created based on the local area workshops. So I'll now talk about some key themes that came up during the area workshops, which relate to what participants felt about LTNs. So during the workshops, participants were asked to share their sort of top of mind views on LTNs before hearing the expert presentation. And we found that what constitutes an LTN and why they were introduced was not always fully understood. This was sometimes because it was not always clear to participants which measures in their area were actually part of an LTN and not part of some other road infrastructure changes which were being implemented locally. And whilst participants generally understood that the measures were introduced to reduce pollution or to encourage walking and cycling, some also perceived them as a way for local authorities to make extra money, for example, through issuing fines. Overall, there was agreement on the need to tackle the climate emergency, but not all were convinced that LTNs would play a role in this. And this was because some felt that the LTN measures were ineffective in reducing emissions due to the displacement of traffic and increased journey times and congestion. And there was also some cynicism about the amount of money being spent on schemes that some saw as inconvenient or ineffective. So after hearing the expert evidence, the participants were given an opportunity to share their initial thoughts and reactions to what they'd heard. Participants appreciated the evidence and data presented on the context for LTNs and how they could help to reduce air pollution. So the quote there from a participant at Wandsworth just demonstrates that appreciation for just having a bit more sort of the contextual information behind LTNs. And people generally expressed openness to efforts to reduce traffic on our roads and were concerned about air pollution and the climate crisis and motivated by a desire to live in a clean and peaceful neighbourhood. And again, that concern is kind of illustrated by that quote there from a member of the Lambeth workshop. However, when reflecting on their lived experience, a participant sometimes felt that the theory of how LTNs should work and their benefits had not always translated well into their day-to-day reality. And you can see from that final quote that it was felt that sometimes the measures hadn't actually worked in the way that was intended. So participants also reflected on how LTNs impact upon different groups of people. As you can see from the slide, a range of groups was discussed, but I'll just pick up on a couple here. So in terms of pedestrians, it was felt that LTNs reduced the threat of speeding cars and the danger of crossing roads for people using the streets. However, some also perceived an increased risk of being victims of crime as a result of quieter streets, especially at night. This concern was perceived to be more of a risk in Lascelles and Lambeth, and some people consequently felt safer being in a car and so chose travelling by car over walking in the LTN, despite that those potentially increased journey times. And in terms of the impacts on disabled people, some participants felt that the rationale for LTNs was not always a practical or realistic option for everyone. So although LTNs were designed so that everyone can reach their properties by car, some found that taxis were no longer able to drop off residents at their front doors, or found that journey times for things like community shuttle buses had increased. However, for those with non-mobility related disabilities, such as sensory impairments, one of the positive impacts mentioned of LTNs included being able to do the school run on foot within a quiet environment and with fewer cars around. So regardless of the views and experiences of LTNs, participants found consensus in wanting consultation and changes or improvements in implementation. So after the first round of workshops, we grouped recommendations into 3 main areas, which were consultation and engagement, implementation, and alternatives to car use. And these categories were taken to the follow-up workshop, where participants from across the areas were able to discuss them and sort of come to a final set of recommendations, which I'll talk through now. So across all the workshops, participants suggested that any consultation should be informative, evidenced, and inclusive. So in terms of making the consultation process informative, participants suggested that local authorities could demonstrate how the LTN is likely to work and provide information in a simple, easy to understand format to residents who live in, near, or travel through a proposed LTN. And consultation should be accompanied by education about why LTNs and a reduction in car usage are deemed necessary. And participants felt that local authorities are more likely to enjoy public support if they demonstrate the positive outcomes for public health, road safety, and the environment. Secondly, consultation and engagement should be evidenced. So the use of evidence, for example, on the extent of air pollution, as well as demonstrating how previous LTNs have been successful, is important for building support for them. And it was also pointed out that without timely and credible evidence from trusted sources, there's a danger that the information void can be quickly filled by misinformation and even conspiracy theories, which once embedded can then be difficult to dispel. And finally, any consultation and engagement should be inclusive, capturing the full diversity of local communities. So this means consulting a representative cross-section of people who live in, near, or travel through the area. And it also means using a range of channels to communicate about and engage people on LTNs to reach people with different needs and preferences. So participants suggested consultation channels such as social media, local TV and radio, public advertising, street stalls, and public meetings in a range of community venues. And consultations should also be accessible to a wide range of people. So for example, communications could be provided in different community languages and available in different formats such as Braille and Easy Read. And participants also felt that implementation was less likely to be perceived as something imposed from the outside if consultation is first championed by people such as local MPs, community leaders, and resident groups. And as a sort of general point, consultation was seen as something which needs to be ongoing, with continual opportunities to provide feedback and regular progress updates to those affected by the scheme. So in terms of implementation, participants suggested that it should be well communicated, integrated, and flexible. So in terms of being well communicated, participants felt that to avoid confusion and ensure that new traffic calming measures don't go unseen or ignored, implementation should take place with several months' notice, ample explanation, and a sort of gradual adjustment period. Traffic calming measures should also be clearly marked on GPS devices, and signs should be obvious and well placed. And it was suggested that people who breach LTN measures should only be issued with warnings on the first occasion rather than fines. So there should be a sort of grace period to allow residents time to understand and adjust to the new measures. And if fines are to be issued, it was suggested that local authorities should clarify why this is necessary and provide full transparency on how the money generated will be used. And fines were considered more acceptable if spent within the LTN, So for example, to subsidise local public transport. LTN implementation should also be carefully integrated with any other simultaneous changes to transport infrastructure in the area. So for example, it should take into account and try and work alongside other major roadworks, expansion of ultra low emission zones, or the introduction of a bordering LTN. And finally, LTNs should also be flexible and enable easy access for those who have no option but to use a car. So for example, disabled residents or service vehicle drivers, or those who are disproportionately inconvenienced by the measures. So perhaps those living by schools, for example. And this could be achieved by having flexible barriers. For example, they could be time bound, and providing resident passes to those who need them. And finally, participants felt that to facilitate mode shift, LTN implementation must be accompanied by a commitment to tackling the issues that currently make cars the default option for many people. So suggestions focused on improvements to walking, bicycles and e-scooters, and public transport. So it was felt that LTNs could be made more pleasant to walk in with the introduction of pedestrianised roads and crossings, planters, and more seating. And completely car-free zones should be considered around schools, and local authorities could do more to prevent on-pavement parking. Additionally, in some areas, neighbourhoods were not felt to be safe unless there are well-lit roads and commitments to reducing crime, such as bicycle theft or knife crime. Residents would also like to see bicycles and e-scooters and the supporting infrastructure provided near to everyone's homes. So more continuous cycle paths, lower speed limits, and fixing potholes would improve road safety, and more secure parking facilities should be provided on both public and residential streets to prevent bicycle theft and damage. Cycling and e-scooter schemes should be provided publicly and be better advertised and subsidised or discounted to those on lower incomes. It's worth noting that currently e-scooters are not a legal form of transport outside of the areas where they're currently being trialled, but they were something that obviously came up in our discussions. So in terms of public transport, participants felt that services should be more frequent, especially at night, and available across a wider area. And also it should be comfortable and accessible to those with mobility related needs. It should also be made more affordable, either through direct subsidisation or incentivisation, for example, bus passes or council tax reductions. And free school buses should be provided to all students who cannot easily walk to school. So in addition to making these alternatives to driving cheaper and more convenient, some residents also proposed measures to make driving more expensive and inconvenient. So for example, through issuing fines more effectively, increasing the presence of traffic wardens, and taxing drivers based on their petrol usage. However, walking, cycling and public transport is also not a realistic option for all people, and participants wanted to see accommodations made for those who cannot use those different modes. So they suggested things like the government providing an integrated and subsidised carpooling service, as well as more disabled parking and car charging points for those who need them. So I'll now just wrap up with a couple of concluding points. So to sort of summarise, the project's brought together 100 people in total from all walks of life from London and Birmingham who've been affected by LTNs. And they discussed their experiences of LTNs, learned about different sides of the debate, and came up with suggestions for future LTN implementation. So We heard from the groups kind of broad support for tackling air pollution and the climate crisis. However, the idea behind LTNs has not always sort of translated into participants' day-to-day reality. So, for example, due to a lack of accessible alternatives to car use, or not having adequate provisions for residents who can't use different modes of transport. And participants suggested that future LTNs or similar schemes should involve informative, inclusive and ongoing consultation and engagement, well communicated and flexible implementation, and complementary measures to make alternatives to car use more affordable, appealing and accessible. And I'm just going to finish up here with a couple of reflections, on the deliberative process. So before and after taking part in the workshops, participants were asked questions to gather their personal reflections on LTNs and whether they had changed their views after the discussions. This exercise was voluntary, so it's only really an illustration of how people found the deliberative process and whether they changed their mind. But overall, participants' answers showed that their views tended not to change much after the workshop, although they came away with a greater understanding of the sort of opposition position. So, for example, those who were initially supportive of LTNs remained supportive, but with a greater understanding of the barriers to acceptance for some. And those initially opposed to LTNs tended to stay opposed, though gained a greater understanding of the environmental case for LTNs. And those quotes there just illustrate each of those points. So through the workshops, participants were able to discuss controversial issues and share constructive points of view. And for many, it was the first time that they'd taken part in something like this, where they were presented with information on a topic, including sort of the wider context and the range of different perspectives on it, and were given time to reflect and then to discuss it with other people with a range of different views. And in taking this approach, the workshops generated considered and thoughtful debate and opened up potential solutions on what is often a contested topic. So thank you very much. I will leave it there and hand back over to Martina.
Thank you very much, Ella, for sharing such great overview of the deliberative workshops that took part and some of these key insights and recommendations that have emerged through the workshops from the study. Next up is a brief video presentation of participants' voices, providing an insight into the participants' view from the workshops. But before we do that, can I just briefly remind everyone that you can submit questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you should also be able to vote for your favorite questions that you would like to be asked. Okay.
I was a little bit negative because, in the first place, I want to listen to it, and I found out, things being implemented without, without proper, consultation and things like that. But I think throughout the workshop, when I get to understand more and talk to others, I think the concept generally is positive. It's just, they have not kind of introduce it in the right way.
So a lot of people in the group felt uninformed about what Lambeth's intentions were, and also what their intentions will be for the future.
And I've been experiencing a lot of difficulty parking close enough to the shops. Sometimes I have maybe a half-mile walk, and by the time I get to the shops, I'm in so much pain. I just can't get around the shops. I have to go back to the car. So I do believe LTNs are valuable. I think it will turn out to be a really good thing. It's just that at this particular moment, it isn't working. It's making things worse.
I guess before today, I just felt it was a bit of an inconvenience, not just to myself that travels into a particular area, but also for some of the residents. But today, I'm a bit more aware, better informed. And I think, again, I would like to see people's individual opinions coming into consideration by the council. So I think if the council can work with people to get this system off the ground, it could be beneficial for all.
Everyone knows the objective of doing this, but they just treated people like they were not human beings anymore. They just went ahead, they said they consulted, we don't know who they consulted.
I was concerned about them. I thought they were potentially going to lead to a great deal of congestion, and I have experienced some congestion in other boroughs because of what's being the changes being made on the roads. But I think that, you know, if time is taken and it's thought through very carefully, potentially it could be very productive.
I've lived here long enough I wanted to be felt like I was considered, my voice was heard.
I think it's interesting that the people that took part, I think we were quite a large extent all on the same page. There was nobody who said, no, you know, don't think there's any problems with traffic or pollution in London, everything's good, everything's fine.
If it has to be implemented in some areas with discussion and consultation, maybe that would work.
What is needed is, first of all, awareness, consultation, and also making sure that the benefits of the LTN is being explained.
Really listening to people's fears about it and money spent in the right places, developing a really good public transport system, providing for locking up bikes, storing bikes, so that it's easy for people. It must be easy for people to make the changes, and it must be attractive for people to make those changes, so that they, you know, one day look back and say it's so much better now.
Found it was quite surprised, you know, like this sort of things are slightly lack of consultation and you know, being improvised, being rolled out so rapidly, you know, without proper testing. So I'm hoping that, you know, by providing all this kind of advice, you know, the council will be able to review it and you know, with the future implementation, that there will be a better way to do it.
I know what the government's trying to do. They're just trying to cut down on the pollution and trying to help us. They have to prioritize. You know, there are other important issues that needs to be addressed within the area. Bus routes, you know, they need to improve all this before they get to the bottom of this.
If you're asking people to change their behaviour, you've got to give them alternatives. And so I think in parallel with asking people to make less use of cars, then it's got to be better public transport, 24-hour, and it's got to be safe.
It needs a public consultation. It needs the community and businesses' perspective on things. It needs the data. It needs the experts for people to understand why and why these particular areas, why this particular road. So it's a lot about communicating the strategy and the direction of an LTN.
A lot of advanced consultation in all different formats, different languages, drop-in centres, a lot of consultation and a lot of listening to how people with all different kinds of disabilities would be affected. I think if there could be more of these consultations or surveys about issues that affect the communities in the Birmingham area, all over the country, people would feel as though they had more of a voice.
Okay, so to join to these voices, I'm very pleased to say we have the pleasure and privilege to have one of our research participants with us today. Please do join me in welcoming Rocky, who will briefly share a researcher participant's point of view in a brief conversation with Ella. Rocky and Ella, over to you.
Thank you,
Hiya.
Martina. Hi, Rocky.
All right.
Good to see you again. So, yeah, I just wondered if I could just ask you a couple of questions basically about your experience of taking
Certainly.
part in the research. So first of all, could you tell me what you thought about LTNs before the research? Did you know much about them?
Well, initially, not much about it. I mean, I've seen some of the things being put in place, but not really in depth, in detail. So, I mean, yeah, beforehand, I don't know much about it at all.
And what did you think about LTNs before taking part?
Well, I think before I take part, because I don't know much about it, I can't really comment on it. Although, I mean, there are things that being done only until when we had the workshop, I realized, oh, that's actually part of it. But, you know, it's just lack of information, I think.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is kind of most important for people to know about what you were discussing with other residents during the workshops?
Well, I mean, it's what's about the LTN, you know, like if everybody get to know it with, you know, consultation or information up front, so people can understand what's being rolled out and whether it's going to be effective, and then people can judge it based on that way, will be a lot better.
And so the research kind of suggests that people thought it was important that approaches to LTNs need to be accompanied by developing more alternatives to car use. So I wondered if you could tell me any more about that, perhaps about some of the suggestions that people were making.
Well, in terms of suggestion, I think it's all about consultation, like what you mentioned just now in the things. I think the whole thing is about safety. People, you know, whether they can do things safely, and then having a lot of feedback and consultation, so that whatever is being rolled out is understandable, and people know why it is there and what's being done. Yeah, I think that's the most important thing.
And is there anything else that you think is important to share that you were discussing with other residents? So, for example, anything around the sort of more about the engagement side, or how they'd actually be implemented? Yeah,
I think I mean, again, you know, it's always about, for me at least, safety and consultation. And essentially, you know, if it's being rolled out, it has to be very clear, you know, with, say, you know, with all the signage, and potentially, you know, integrated with all the map and apps, SatNav, because when we are living in the location within the area, we may know about it and see things being done. But for people traveling into this area, you know, without proper signage or information, or even, you know, like Google Map or SatNav information, they wouldn't be able to react to it, and it will just cause chaos. So I think having that level of information and making sure everything works out with the supportive kind of data would be very beneficial.
Mm-hmm. And was there anything that particularly concerned you about LTNs, or how they might be used in the future?
I mean, initially, in terms of concern, initially, they I think they roll out too quickly. So I've heard, I've seen cases like, say, the ambulance was kind of blocked and they couldn't get through and things like that. So that's why, I mean, this is why it's good that we are looking into it and trying to provide feedback so that they can do better, and making sure everybody get to know what are being done, and in terms of the kind of road system, you know, they can do a better kind of like preparation beforehand. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Rocky. I think we'll leave it there because I think we've only got about a minute left. So thank you very much for joining us. It's good to see you again, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Cheers.
Martina, I'll hand back over to you.
Many thanks for sharing your thoughts and experiences with us today, Rocky. And thanks to our speakers, Ollie Lord and Ella Gascott, for such interesting, insightful presentations. Let me now introduce you to our panel of respondents who will share their first responses to the study findings with us. So with us today, we have Agathe de Canson. Agathe is a policy advisor at the Green Alliance Environment think tank. She works with political stakeholders and advocate for action on the climate crisis, focusing on decarbonising transport in the UK. And she has also worked on the environmental impacts of Brexit and trade. We also have with us today Simone Ahiaku. Simone is a climate justice campaigner, writer and educator who has contributed to environmental, social and cultural work in Bristol, London and across the UK. She currently uses facilitated workshops to explore climate colonialism and examples of climate resistance and movements in the past and present. She was also at the National Union of Students working on the Decolonise Education campaign. And finally, Dr. Suzanne Bartington, who is a public health clinician and environmental epidemiologist. Suzanne is a clinical research fellow in the Institute of Applied Health Research and fellow of the Faculty of Public Health. She's also a co-lead of the University of Birmingham Institute for Global Innovation Clean Air Theme and UK Research and Innovation Regional Clean Air Champion for the Midlands to North of England. Now, can I please invite Agathe as our first respondent today to share her thoughts?
Thanks, Martina. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it will work. Oops. Okay, so that should hopefully be working for everyone. Lovely to be here, and thank you very much to NatCen for having me and for their really great research on low traffic neighbourhoods. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the climate change side of things and why active travel is such an important part of getting to net zero in the UK, and about what this research on low traffic neighbourhoods teaches us on how we'll be able to get to net zero. So here is, here is some context around transport and climate change. So transport is responsible for almost a third of the UK's emissions. And of those emissions, cars, taxis, vans are responsible for over half. So without tackling transport, and in particular road transport, the UK just simply won't be able to meet its climate targets. So that's why this research in LTNs is particularly relevant and important. One solution is, of course, to switch to electric vehicles, but that's not the whole answer. And we do also need to reduce traffic and drive less to reach net zero. Another reason for needing to encourage people to drive less is air pollution, and I know this has already been spoken about today. but this photo was taken in London last week and shows just how bad air pollution can get in our cities. And it does cause up to 36,000 premature deaths, and around a third of nitrogen oxide pollution comes from road transport, with local road traffic contributing up to 80%. So it's a really significant issue. In terms of where we stand on this and where progress is being made, we know there is appetite for change. The government wants public transport and active travel to be the natural first choice for our daily activities. It's also said that it wants half of all journeys in towns and cities to be walked or cycled by 2030. But what we need now is plans and delivery for these to turn this ambition into action. And we know at the more local level as well that 3/4 of local authorities across the UK have now declared a climate emergency. And actually many of those local authorities have set net zero targets that are more ambitious than the national one. So the national one says net zero by 2050, but many local authorities in the UK have targets for net zero by 2040 or even by 2030. So really ambitious targets. And for many of the UK's local authorities, transport is actually the highest emitting sector or second highest. So without tackling transport, they won't be able to reach their own targets. And in terms of public opinion, there is support for climate change action. Britain's ranked climate change in the top 4 issues facing the country consistently. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's the 3rd or the 2nd. And we saw that especially around COP26. So in principle, there is public support for action on climate. But what this research shows is that that doesn't always translate to support for some of the measures that are being put in place, especially when the policies haven't been communicated clearly, where there hasn't been adequate consultation, and so on. So this stands for low traffic neighbourhoods, but it also stands for really every single policy that's going to need to be put in place for the UK to reach net zero, particularly those that are going to affect people's local areas. What this research shows is that you really need to have deep engagement and communication with the public, otherwise your policies to tackle climate change could backfire or be scrapped. And we really don't have that much time. So it is good to encourage consultation. So low traffic neighbourhoods should also be presented as part of a wider package to tackle climate change, but other issues as well, like air pollution, congestion, and so on. And that's because when people feel like it's been communicated to them why measures are being put in place and what the goal is and what the vision is, they're actually much more likely to support it. So for the success of these measures, we do need wider packages to be put in place. And we also need people to feel like they've got alternatives to driving as well. That's really key to success. So here are just some examples of measures that can be put in place to tackle emissions from transport at the local level. Low traffic neighbourhoods, obviously, and over time, most of them are effective not only at reducing emissions from within the low traffic neighbourhood zone, but also outside on boundary roads. Clean air zones as well. Cycling and walking infrastructure is really important in terms of providing those alternatives. School streets, bus lanes, they make bus journeys faster, so they make public transport more attractive, so they're also quite important. Improving green spaces, infrastructure for electric vehicles, bike and e-scooter rental schemes are also a good way in for people who don't necessarily own a bike or e-scooters. And it generally, there are lots of options, and it's an opportunity for local leaders to think creatively, I think. So one option that I particularly like is electric cargo bikes for deliveries, but you've also got a range of other things like speed limits, reallocating parking spaces, and so on. And so as we've been talking about, it's really important that all residents can get behind these packages of measures. And so what you need is really good consultation, really careful design, and you can also use things like grace periods, exemptions, and both of those we used for the ultra low emission zone in London, which has been really successful in bringing down air pollution. Scrappage schemes as well, so that people don't get trapped in older polluting vehicles. And also something which I think is quite important is to demonstrate the impact that these measures have had for people once the scheme's been put in place. So I think all of those things, if done, can really make a difference for transport emissions. And I'm just going to finish by talking about how these measures that I've just been talking about, that are sort of transport specific, can be delivered, because it's quite complicated. And I'm sure a lot of people listening who are involved with local authorities or this kind of work will know that it is quite complex in terms of who's in charge of what and who's expected to deliver what. So local authorities, they are actually quite well placed to be delivering a lot of these changes, and that's because they have local on the ground expertise. They'll know who to talk to when they're carrying out their consultations. They're also actually more trusted than national government when it comes to local issues. So 4 times more trusted than local government when it comes to local issues. And a lot of these things are actually under their direct control. So local authorities do have the ability to make a lot of these changes happen when it comes to active travel. But they do face a lot of constraints. Part of those constraints are to do with skills and having the right skills within their workforce to design and deliver these plans. Also having the right skills in their local area to actually deliver these changes. So you do need people who will be able to deliver new, say, cycling infrastructure. And if you're thinking about net zero more broadly, it might be skills to do with insulation or installing heat pumps and so on. And they've also faced really severe constraints when it comes to funding, because they simply don't have enough funding. So that is a very big issue, and it's very hard for them to prioritize schemes to do with active travel or decarbonisation in general when they are so constrained when it comes to funding. And also a lot of the pots to deliver these changes are quite short term when it comes to the funding, so that it's funding for a couple of years, but it doesn't give councils and local authorities the long-term visibility that they need to be able to plan their transition. Another issue is the planning system, which isn't really conducive to delivering active travel for local areas. And also the fact that local authorities don't get a lot of say on public transport provision and how that works. And what we've seen from the research conducted by NatCen is that public transport is actually really important for people, and the provision of good, sort of high quality, affordable public transport, if that isn't there and you put in a low traffic neighbourhood, then it's quite likely that there will not be the public support for that low traffic neighbourhood. So that's also a really important point. And so that's where national government can come in terms of designing good frameworks that really demonstrate who is responsible for what. And when it comes to climate change, there's also an issue around the measurement of emissions. Sometimes quite hard for local authorities and local leaders to even know what emissions they're responsible for and measure those emissions. So there needs to be some work around that. greater and sort of better managed funding, as I've talked about. Policy at the national level. So for example, policy to do with public transport. I think that's where the national government should be playing a greater role, but also to do with electric vehicles. Regulations as well from national government. So for example, to do with air quality or electric vehicle charging infrastructure, that sort of thing. Planning reform to promote active travel. And also, and this sort of speaks to the skills challenge, they should also be issuing more guidance for local authorities, toolkits, and helping as well bridge that skills gap that I talked about earlier, whether that's for local authorities or indeed on a national level. So that's an overview. I think this year, in terms of what we can expect from government, we can look out for local transport plans. There'll be a consultation out this year where the government's going to set out its plans for local transport. We'll also set up Active Travel England, which should help in terms of giving guidance on what good cycling and walking infrastructure looks like. So that will definitely be progress. And also there will be some sort of economic statement from the Chancellor in the spring, and that should be taken as an opportunity to give greater funding to local authorities for them to deliver this change, and also just more money in general for active travel. In summary, public support is really crucial to achieve net zero, and this research on low traffic neighbourhoods is a really good example of that. Reducing traffic is crucial to help tackle emissions and meet our climate change targets. And low traffic neighbourhoods are a really important part of doing that, but they should be presented as part of a wider package and a wider vision. And finally, everyone has a role to play, from national government down to local authorities, mayoral authorities, but also obviously every single citizen has a role to play. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Agathe. Simon, can I invite you next for some of your reflections?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just gonna share my screen just here. Right. Cool. Can everyone see that? I hope so. But hi everyone, I'm Simone, and yeah, I'm a campaigns and influencing consultant at NUS, and I have a huge interest in climate justice. So today I'll be touching on LTNs not being a one size fits all, and particularly how different groups are affected, particularly marginalized groups. So I'll touch on like an initial response to the research, common public misconceptions, how it affects different groups, particularly marginalized groups, and then where do we go from here? So initial response to the findings. So I kind of had like 3 initial responses, and one was understanding. So like understanding that for many residents, the LTNs were implemented over lockdown with haste. So there was a huge expectation for like residents and locals to like be on board with it without the proper onboarding process happening. Also that like LTNs are an aspect of a just transition, but there needs to be like a holistic approach shaped by marginalized people. So LTNs have been spoken about for several years, as we've like heard, they've been here since the 70s. And while some people are staunchly pro or anti-LTNs, a lot of people are in the movable middle. And with this, they're just asking for their critique and experiences to be considered, and not just on a personal level, but also how it affects their community as well. And then like, in order for us to kind of see a societal shift, local councils have a responsibility to address other social aspects like proximity to services, public and private, employment, community infrastructure that would impact car usage. So like people driving far to access certain spaces, services, and institutions could indicate that there is a lack in their local area and investment is needed. So like if your local school and your local hospital that you need for your healthcare is all in different areas that are quite far from you, then that shows that there is a need for investment and local investment in particular. Finally, like the best thing about like the research coming out was that there was a huge willingness to learn from like local people. Like it was actually really delightful to see that like throughout the process, loads of the like participants were on board with tackling like particularly like climate change and like air pollution as like a public health, climate and social issue. And like after hearing the like expert evidence and like just hearing more about low traffic neighborhoods and what they're meant to be doing, they like welcomed the idea of like having safer, quieter and cleaner neighborhoods where like everyone could use like active travel and public transport. So going on to like misconceptions of public opinion, especially for marginalized communities. So there's a public misconception that like people, particularly people from marginalized groups, whether that's your class, race, gender, sexuality, ability, migration status, the list goes on, that they're not interested in climate solutions. And like some will go further to say or claim that that they actively oppose such developments. And like this is not true and often minimalizes the concerns over how people will be affected by these decisions in the long run. And like, what is more concerning is that with this presumption in mind, there's a hesitancy for change makers, policymakers, and members of local councils to consult marginalized communities with the idea that they just won't engage. That's in quotation marks, by the way. This means that their experience, expertise, and solutions are ignored at change-making levels. It also means less energy is put into community engagement strategies of reaching out to these marginalized groups, such as like trying to communicate with them in their language or trying to find different ways to communicate with them if they're not heavily on the internet. We see a huge gap in policy and council members trying to connect with community organizers, activists, and local community projects tackling social and climate issues. And I think there is a way for this team with this research and team with community activists, we can bring those together to like bring local people on board with our like climate solutions. And so as we've seen from the LTN research, many people on first impression actually did understand what LTNs were used for. And like they discussed the ways that like it would be beneficial for their like safety and for the ways that they want to navigate through life. They knew what it was. And like it shows that like what marginalized people bring to the light is how implementations of LTNs and other socio-economic implementations affect people who are often not considered in the ways we can make sure we're implementing social and climate solutions that are beneficial for all, rather than just doing them and expecting people to be on board. And so how do LTNs affect marginalized residents? So I've got some positives here. One of them is quieter streets. So a lot of people remarked on like better quality of sleep from reduced noise and greater sense of road safety, preventing road traffic accidents occurring on the streets. And that was a huge one with parents. And yeah, a lot of people have remarked since lockdown has started that drivers have been driving quite dangerously. So having LTNs there has like forced them to slow down and take more precaution when driving. Also better air quality. So in some areas, people mentioned not coughing as much, not being so hazy in the eyes from air pollution. And for those that live in like London, especially South London, you may have seen the government kind of announcement to stay inside last week because of such high levels of air pollution. So it meant that cyclists and people that like to go for walks and jogs couldn't do that. And like, thankfully, with LTNs being around, people were able to breathe better with the less cars around. And this is beneficial for all people, but particularly those with breathing difficulties and disabilities such as asthma. Also safer streets. So cyclists and like people in general mentioned like feeling a lot safer to like walk and cycle on these residential roads because of like less cars and slower flow of traffic. And it's like, though we do still need to tackle air quality levels, which would impact the way that people can cycle and like use active travel, this was generally great for people that are currently cycling and using safer active ways of traveling already. And also like it's beneficial for children for streets to be safer because like they're less likely to be harmed or like knocked over, for example. And like, what does this tell us? It tells us that like LTNs do work to tackle some health, safety and well-being issues, and have created some beneficial outputs for residents, and has encouraged them to use like active modes of travel. Now that like the roads are safer, we are seeing more people cycling, we are seeing more people walking to school and walking to work even. So that's really brilliant. So how do LTNs affect marginalized residents? What are the negatives of it? And it's interesting because a lot of the positives kind of flipped into the negatives as well. So quieter streets have led to more antisocial behaviors. We've seen this across the news with women, cis and trans women, being harmed or disappearing on their walks home. And there's higher stakes for women feeling unsafe on quieter streets. There's also higher stakes for working class people, LGBT+ people, and people of color being attacked on their way home also. So again, this fear of like quieter streets with less witnesses especially is terrifying to many. And like here, I want to highlight that it is like the systemic ways violence like poverty, homophobia, sexual and racial violence is woven into our society and individual behaviors, because some of these things would not, a lot of these things in fact would not be happening if we had adequate systemic issues sorted out. Also, worse air quality. So like, rather than reducing traffic on the roads, it's believed that LTNs have displaced like the air pollution, noise pollution to lower socioeconomic groups and ethnic minority areas, which are more negatively impacted. And as they live closer to areas with high traffic, such as like areas like Lambeth, Lewisham, Lozells, Tower Hamlets, for example, are all examples of areas with the worst air pollution in London and Birmingham, and some of the highest populations of working class people of colour. So here we see like a huge correlation between racial and environmental injustice, and the ways that like working class people of colour are placed across the UK is a huge indicator of environmental racism as well, because they're more likely to be placed by like incinerator/waste sites, places with the worst air pollution, places with the highest like car usage. So the list kind of goes on from there. And then we also need to like speak about the impacts on the everyday working person. So like car users said that they experienced journey times being longer due to displaced traffic and increased congestion on the main roads, with suggested implications on the earnings on day-to-day activities. So this goes on to a wider thing about like job security and workers' pay. For example, like many working class people work in the gig economy with little to no job protections due to their contracts. So a lot of them are doing like Uber and Deliveroo, etc. LTNs affecting their cash flow could really impact an already struggling household. So it's also considering the eroding of the social state over the last like 10, 15 years. Many people and families aren't receiving much financial government support to cope with this. So it's like, on one hand, people are being fined and can't get to work and aren't earning as much, but they're also not getting the state support that they previously had or have never had access to. And those who depend on public transport to get around, such as like young families and older people, have also experienced like longer waiting times because of the displaced traffic. Some of them having to walk longer in order to access these public transports that they need. And for like older people, for example, that isn't great, or for people that have mobility issues. And so what does that tell us about like LTNs and like the research is that like the fear of crime, for example, isn't a result of like people behaving badly. Like there are issues that run deeper than that. These areas, especially that these things are happening, have been historically underfunded in opportunities, jobs, youth centres, care centres, access to healthy food, green spaces, healthcare, etc. This is as much a socio-economic problem as an environmental one, and it tells us that LTN implementations must be accompanied by a commitment to tackling the issues that currently make cars like the most attractive option. There should be like, for example, cheaper and more accessible transport, and not a transport service, for example, that consistently raises its prices for its fare. And then a huge one is, how do LTNs affect disabled people? So it's seen as like not practical or realistic. To reduce car usage, a lot of disabled people do rely on cars. And for those with mobility issues, encouraging them to walk or cycle simply isn't realistic for how they live. It also blames and individualizes the issue and puts blame on disabled people for using cars. As said earlier, like they really do rely on cars to kind of live a self-sufficient life. So like when they are being fined for going into LTN areas or driving faster, for example, it's not reflective of like a society we want to work towards, where like people who are already marginalized are still suffering under the system. And also when we take into consideration government support for disabled people in particular has eroded over the last 10 years, with some people receiving as little as £90 a week. This would make their day-to-day life harder and expensive for them to not be able to use cars. But on the flip side, there have been some benefits. So with the cleaner air quality, it means that like people with like breathing difficulties or disabilities have been reporting to breathe better, and that's really brilliant. As we know, bad air quality is really dangerous and can be a source of death. So it's good to know that people are feeling better. And also it positively affects like people that have sensory overloads and impairments. So the safer streets mean that people aren't feeling overwhelmed by like loads of cars being on the roads, and like people just being everywhere on the pavement, and people feel like they can actually take that active travel and go out because the streets are quieter, especially for those that don't have mobility issues, but some that do are also taking out for active travel. And so finally, where do we go from here? So it's important, I think, with the like revelations of this like LTN research, which has been brilliant, it's about like not replicating models of oppression. And by this, we mean that LTNs or any solutions to air quality and the climate crisis should not replicate models of oppression that leave marginalized people facing the biggest consequences. Disabled people, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and ethnic minorities and their areas of living are not sacrifice zones for climate solutions to work. We should also be trying to provide like a bigger vision for climate and society, and bringing people into that vision and making sure that we're working towards achieving it. So like, as I sort of said earlier, like there is a responsibility for councils to kind of provide that vision, and the government, but also shaping that with like local people, community organizers, and like showing people that one, we can like dream it, and two, like there's work to be done to make it possible. And then finally, like building on social and community infrastructure. So along with like LTNs being implemented, for example, like and like green installations and public transport, we can also like think about community gardening schemes and bike schemes and other community infrastructure that the communities that are affected decide that they need from the LTN areas. So yeah, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Simone. Now, last but certainly not least, Suzanne, your reflections.
Thank you, Martina, and thank you, Natsen, for sharing the findings of your very interesting research. Wanted to really pick up on a few key themes, both in terms of from a public health perspective, but also thinking about the research gaps that still exist in the evidence. Firstly, I think thinking about framing the narrative, and that's something which really resonated throughout participants' responses. So that lack of clarity about what the intervention is, and we know from a public health perspective, it's very difficult for people to change their behaviour or accept an intervention if it's not even understood that there is a problem in the first place, or if that perception of the problem doesn't match why that intervention is being introduced. So that sort of discordance there, really, understanding the problem, framing why we need this and where it sits in the broader scheme. So I think we've heard already some of those important points, that LTNs are not happening in isolation and shouldn't be conceived in such a way that they are perceived to do so, because this fits in a much broader challenge we have about changing the way we travel. As we've already heard, the huge challenge in the transport sector for reducing carbon emissions and national impacts of poor air quality upon health. So how do you frame that vision? How do you make that vision? Well, communication is absolutely critical. I think we've heard that again and again here, and that's not just communication with the general public, but also with those involved in implementing the schemes, those policymakers, so particularly local councillors that are on the front line. We're dealing with those reactions to the schemes, the local media as well, and businesses, and being proactive about communication. And I know certainly learned from my work with local government that being proactive reaps rewards rather than being reactive at a later stage. So being ready with those important, clear, consistent messages about why this scheme is needed, what it is intending to do, what the evidence base is behind it, and being there armed with that information. Consultation, I wanted to say a couple of words about the process of consultation. So I think this comes back to what we've heard already about involvement and engagement, but consultation is often very complex and difficult to access. And I think that key element about inclusivity is really important. Involving groups at an early stage, so you're moving really towards co-production of these initiatives and that community level of ownership. We know that that has been very beneficial with transport schemes elsewhere, thinking beyond LTNs, and actually the fact that you need to start that at a very early pre-consultation stage is really important. But understanding to what extent is the community involved in consultation? Are we really hearing from that silent majority? Understanding some of the demographic characteristics around who does respond and what are the key themes that come out of those processes. And this is something that's just the focus of research at the University of Birmingham. What can we also share between different locations? I think it's really interesting that these workshops, and we've heard some of the narrative voices from both London and Birmingham, but really this was an extraordinary natural opportunity through the Emergency Active Travel funded scheme for multiple introduction of different schemes in different locations at the same time. Of course, much of the existing knowledge from an academic sense came from London boroughs, and of course, the going back to Waltham Forest, and had the privilege of being able to go and see that scheme for myself and experience it. But that was a different context in terms of delivery. So what can we learn from these different schemes that are being implemented at different scales, different geographical coverage, different communities across the country in that period of time? And I think that's really, really fascinating. And we've just begun to generate some of the insights here with those voices from London and Birmingham. So what works well and where, and how much can you take that intervention and then introduce it elsewhere and get the same potential benefits as well? And not reinventing the wheel or materials between local authorities that are undertaking these schemes. Linked to that, to be able to do that well and to be able to look back and evaluate schemes well, you need to have robust data. So from an academic perspective, if we really want to understand how effective these schemes are, and I'm talking about that in a very broad public health sense, it's not just one data source. We need to understand traffic levels. We need to understand air quality levels of different pollutants. We need to understand noise pollution. We need behavior and travel choices data as well, but we need that for a long period of time before that intervention is introduced. Now, we always don't have the ability to do that, particularly in the context of course, that window of opportunity in COVID recovery or early phase of the COVID pandemic when schemes were introduced rapidly. But being able to learn now, what do we need in future in order to robustly evaluate the scheme? And I think this really comes back to being armed with that evidence base for future consultation so that we can really understand that, yes, this does have an impact, this does have an effect, as well as knowing what the baseline problems and challenges, for example, of air pollution in a local area are. How many cases of childhood asthma does that cause in a year, in a single area, communicated in a way that people can actually easily relate to? Another point which often comes up in the dialogue and in the research dialogue around LTNs is this issue about trade-offs and conflicts and displacement. And I think it's just important to reiterate that to robustly understand impacts involves monitoring and assessment, not just within the area, but beyond that area, but also going a step beyond and thinking, well, actually, where is that disproportionate effect falling? How many people live in that area compared to how many people live in the area which is receiving a potential benefit? So I think quantifying those trade-offs is really important in moving to a more objective sense. And ultimately, the initiatives, of course, need to be designed such that they deliver the greatest benefits. And that typically is in those more densely populated residential areas, though, of course, we're beginning to see different schemes emerge in very different contexts as well. But thinking about that when we need to have the numbers in order to then address some of the counter arguments against such schemes. I think linked to that as well is timescales, and again, the importance of gathering information over longer periods of time to really understand the schemes. And as we've heard already, it can take time both to understand these changes, to respond to them, particularly when we're thinking about the way behaviours change and travel behaviours. That takes much longer. And of course, again, coming back to some of the research undertaken in London boroughs, it was far later on that actually began to see impacts upon car ownership as well as those transport choices. And I think ultimately, really, it's what is the bigger picture, and why are we doing this? What is the actual problem that is being addressed? And I think we heard already that framing that in a very, very clear, consistent way is going to be absolutely critical in making the case for the need for these interventions. We certainly know that we do need to do something. I mean, we do need to have or make radical changes in our transport choices. At the moment, about 1/5 of trips are under a mile in length. And we know that the most rapid and effective way to decarbonise the transport sector is via modal shift to walking and cycling. So we need a lot more research evidence. We can now begin to put that together because, as I said, there's been this tremendous opportunity, and we can begin to understand a lot more of this process outside London as well. But ultimately, I think what's really important around the dialogue is that low traffic neighbourhoods are really considered from a public health sense. They're not a specific air quality intervention. They're not a specific traffic management intervention. They're intended to benefit health and quality of life. Investment in communication and think about the budget that goes into comms is absolutely critical. And ultimately, you want to optimise the scheme so that you get the greatest benefit for environment, the local economy, and public health. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Many thanks on all your reflections to Agath, Simone and Suzanne. We now have time for some questions and answers, and we have a large number of questions, so we might not manage to go through all of them, but let's see how we get on. So as a brief reminder, if you do want to ask some questions, in addition to the ones that are already up there, you can do so by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And why don't I start with an easy one? So I might take the first one, the easy one, and I'll hand all the difficult ones over to all of you. So the first question, or one that really comes up often that I can answer, is can the slides please be made available later on? So this event is recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube afterwards. So the slides will be available as part of the video that will be uploaded there. So you should be able to access the slides through those means. Okay, that was the easy one. Now to the difficult ones. So what I'll do, I'll just read up some questions and I'll suggest who they might be for, but others, please feel free to pitch in with your thoughts and knowledge here. So Ollie, I think this first one might be for you. Is the name Low Traffic Neighbourhood the best way to describe the benefits, or do people think it's mainly about not being able to use your car as easily, i.e. losing something rather than gaining something?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they've kind of answered the question a little bit themselves. I mean, my background's psychology, and I think, yeah, I think we really should consider what we're calling these schemes. Firstly, so that they kind of talk to the local community, you know, according to, like, you know, how that neighborhood has developed over time, and maybe there are local references that you could draw into what you're trying to create. But also, I think saying low traffic also makes it feel quite negative. So there's a council in London that has started to call the measures they're bringing in people-friendly streets, for example, because that's effectively what a lot of these measures are about. It's actually putting the person first and then putting the vehicle second, but making sure it meets everyone's needs. So yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Perfect. Okay, the next one might be for Suzanne. So the question of traffic displacement often comes up in relation to low traffic neighborhoods. Do we have answers from research as yet as to whether this is a real problem?
Great question, thank you. It's ongoing. So we, at the moment at the University of Birmingham, for example, we're undertaking research around LTNs. Anyone who's familiar with air quality research will know that it is immensely complex and that we're dealing with very, very small incremental changes on the back of both influences of weather and season, other COVID-related changes in travel patterns as well. And as I mentioned already, often quite scant baseline data for really understanding schemes in terms of those actual emissions changes. So I think to say that we're yet to fully understand it, we do need more data. And I think the absolutely key is getting that baseline in place before the actual LTN is introduced. That's why I don't think we should call them LTNs as well, because we need to avoid acronyms. But so we have a project in Oxford City, for example, which is gathering that data. And also I think noise quality is really important to include as well as air quality.
Thank you very much. Okay, this one might be for Ella, but others feel free to pitch in as well. There is a perception in part of London that low traffic neighbourhoods were introduced as a means of removing rat-running traffic and not to improve air quality. This is because the key metric for determining its success is on car ownership, which have not necessarily reduced. Is this considered as part of the research?
Thanks, Martina. So this didn't sort of specifically come up in the workshop discussions. So I don't think, as far as I'm aware, it didn't seem that there was a perception that LTNs had been introduced to remove rat running traffic. But there were sort of other concerns that there were sort of other priorities of local authorities, such as that it was kind of, as I mentioned in the presentation, I think about a sort of money-making scheme through issuing fines and things like that, which was kind of seen as, you know, where were the local authorities' priorities actually lying? And I think sort of related to the last question, people were definitely hungry for more evidence about how LTNs actually reduced air pollution, and I think that was a point that they made, that they felt that having some kind of evidence which really demonstrated that would help kind of get people on board during like engagement processes.
Thanks, Ella. I think my next question really builds on this, and I think perhaps, Suzanne, you've partially answered this, but you might be able to sort of pitch in on this one as well. So this one is not necessarily about sort of just displacing traffic, but the question is really about whether LTNs and similar schemes might increase per journey carbon emissions because of making journeys longer, in effect, and increasing congestion, and whether there is any evidence on whether this is the case and any measurable successes in mitigating the climate impacts of these potential effects.
I mean, again, it's a very insightful question, and I think what's important again is it comes back to the available data. So we can either rely upon modeled data or measured data, and actually understand the way in people are making those travel choices is really important to be able to understand that at a hyperlocal scale. I mean, I think what's also relevant there is that so any benefits, for example, from nitrogen dioxide reduction will be felt very, very locally, so particularly, of course, immediate to roadside, whereas your carbon benefits are a lot broader in terms of carbon reduction, and also they tend to take longer in terms of people changing their choices and ultimately shifting mode. So I think what's important is yes, getting the right data to be able to put numbers to that, but also understanding that ultimately the intention is that those proportion of shorter trips will be shifted to other modes, more sustainable modes of travel, which again can potentially offset a lower proportion of slightly longer journeys. But ultimately your localized air quality benefit is likely to be felt at a local level. So sorry, I'm not sure I fully answered that, but I think again, more research is needed.
Perfect. And I think sort of linked question to this one, which maybe perhaps one for Ella to see whether some of this has come up in the research, and perhaps to Suzanne or others. I'm also interested in whether e-scooters and e-bikes are undermining the hoped for safety improvements in low traffic neighborhoods, and what controls have proved effective.
I'm happy to come in on this. I think they're an important part actually of the transition towards more active travel. But it's really important that there's a dedicated infrastructure for them, because the last thing that you want is your pavements to be littered with e-scooters or e-bikes that are just sort of randomly placed there. So you need to have, and this is where sort of parking reallocation can come in as well, parking spaces. So using some of the space on the roads for rental schemes like e-scooters or e-bikes, so that people have a dedicated place to park them, and so that they are sort of a better, I think that's a better way of going about it, and of avoiding that issue of potentially undermining the progress being made on active travel. But it's worth saying that for a lot of people in cities, owning a bike is quite hard because you don't necessarily have space to store it, and it can be quite an expensive upfront cost. So I do think these schemes are very important. And in terms of accessibility as well, when we're talking about e-scooters and e-bikes, that's pretty important. It does mean that people who might not usually cycle or use a scooter are able to use them. So older people, or younger people, actually teenagers, that sort of thing. So I think they're quite important.
Perfect, thank you so much, Agath. I have a question that possibly a number of you could answer or pitch in on. So Rocky, Ollie, and Agath, there's a number of questions that have arisen really about the process of consultation around these low traffic neighborhoods. Some are around the fact that consultations have been had, but that perhaps they weren't well attended and people aren't fully aware. And so how could these consultations be done better and reach more people and engage people without paying them? And the other one was around what is an ideal timescale for prior notice before introducing some of these schemes, and sort of where's the right balance between risking people forgetting about them because the implementation period is quite long, and people not being aware because it's too fast.
Maybe I can jump in a little bit quickly before Ella can wrap up. I think, like Ella mentioned, having somebody locally would be very helpful to gather all this information as a feedback, and especially having like social media, some sort of platform that people can upload the information, so it can be a live kind of interactive data for other to know what's happening and what need to be looked at. I think that would be very useful. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'll contribute. Well, having worked at regional authority before on public consultations, they are very difficult things to get right in terms of getting the number of responses, making sure you're reaching all the communities. I know a lot of authorities try their best, and there are definitely still ways to improve that. And I've seen that recently actually with some local authorities in London, where they've, because that's where I live, where they've actually used tools. There's a tool called Commonplace that I've seen is getting much more used now, where you can visually represent what the proposals are in the neighborhood, and people can actually click on a map and then actually say, this is the bit I like, or this is the bit I don't like, and don't forget about this as well, which I think really helps to transform how people can respond and understand proposals, rather than it just being like a long survey, you're doom scrolling through it, going like, which bit do I actually want to answer? And this question referred to this plan over here, I've got to download that, now I'm stuck with the PDF somewhere on my computer. So I think that sort of thing really helps. I think, a lot of these low traffic neighborhoods were brought in through experimental traffic orders, which have pros and cons, which I kind of mentioned earlier. One con is that they start to come in quite soon, and that you start to consult with the schemes. So some people, unless you've actually communicated to your residents, might start to feel a bit caught out. The pro of it, though, is again going back to psychological background, is kind of actually people start to experience what this is about whilst they're responding at the same time, because a lot of the time when you consult on things ahead of the game, it's still very difficult to visualize the change, and actually you might end up with a lot more negative response, because I believe there's been some evidence that actually when these schemes have been in for quite a considered period of time, people start to actually think, oh, that actually isn't as bad as first thought they were. The reason a lot of these came in experimentally was also related to the stipulation from the government. We're also very much in response to a pandemic, but we need to bear in mind that a lot of local authorities have actually been consulting on transport plans and transport strategies for a considered period of time, which arguably could be a lot more, attractive for residents to respond to rather than just being stale documents. But in these documents, the ambition and the strategy has been there. So, over time, ex-council wants to help to enable more people to be less car dependent, blah, blah, blah. So there have almost been quite a few local authorities that have been stacking up these sort of wonderful schemes that they've been wanting to do. And then suddenly the government went, boom, here's loads of money to do this stuff, against the backdrop of local authorities having had their funding cut by about half over the past 10 years, so not being able to do this stuff. Suddenly it's boom, do this stuff, and you have to spend this money in the next 6 months. So there were some very interesting circumstances that took place alongside the implementation of these schemes over the past couple of years. And I do wonder now that hopefully, if there's going to be some stability in the funding and the strategy, that maybe these will get ironed out in forthcoming schemes.
Perfect. Okay. Simone, I think you're absolutely spot on with your thoughts on the pros and cons of low traffic neighbourhoods for marginalised groups. Do we have any analysis on who actually owns and drives cars the most? Does it tend to be the better off people who can afford the luxury of a car, or more the average working person that you were referring to, such as people who need cars or vans for their work, taxi drivers and so on?
Good question. I don't have the specific statistics, but if I find some, I will try and send them through. But when I was referring to that, it was like the everyday sort of working person. So I don't think cars are though they are a luxury, I think a lot of people do own cars as a means to like work a job. So I was referring to like people that use like taxis, vans for work, cars for work. Yeah, that is what I meant.
Perfect, thanks. And
can I jump in quickly on this, because I think it's really interesting, and it sort of ties back into the comments we made around consultation, and I totally agree with everything that Ollie's just said on consultation. But we need to remember, building on what's being said as well, is that in cities, the poorer households are the least likely to own a car, actually. And that doesn't take away from anything that Simone has said. It's still extremely important to consider how low traffic neighbourhoods and other measures affect people who do have a car. But in terms of those households who don't own a car, it is in cities those who are the least well off. So that's quite important to note. It's also important to note that they might be the kinds of people who are the least likely to respond to consultations as well. So I think someone earlier was talking about a silent majority, and it ties back as well to what Ollie was saying, which is that once low traffic neighbourhoods are put in, and once they've been put in for a while, people who live in and around them actually do like them and don't want them to be scrapped. So I think this is all sort of interesting and important context to bear in mind as well when we're talking about consultations and about low traffic neighbourhoods more generally.
Thank you so much. So we might have time for maybe one or two more questions. So Suzanne, you've talked about quantifying how many people benefit from reductions in traffic compared to how many people experience increases in order to push back on objections. How would you factor into that the likelihood that those who experience benefits are probably already better off, and those who are experiencing the negatives may well be already worse off?
Yeah, another great question. Yes, so it comes back to the sort of the data and the epidemiological methods underlying the calculations that are taken. But what you can look at is, for example, how many dwellings or households are located in a particular area, where they're located in with regard to roadside or further away from the roadside, how many people live there, and then what their characteristics are. So what's the level of deprivation of that local area? And just coming back to poor air quality, which is the sort of primary focus of our research, is that we know that air pollution doesn't have the same impact on different people. So those who have pre-existing vulnerabilities, whether that be chronic disease, or if they are pregnant, if they are a child or an elderly person, they're going to be more vulnerable to the effects of poor air quality. And we know already from existing data that there's we tend to see these factors, all these multiple environmental insults, as we call them, in the same location. So high areas of socioeconomic deprivation alongside high areas of air pollution and high areas of noise pollution. But typically that will actually be not necessarily generated by those residents themselves. It will be coming from others and disproportionately exposing them to those effects. So I think it's really important understanding the demography of the area, not just necessarily saying X number of people live in this particular area, but what are the characteristics of them? And I think this links through to my point about designing these schemes to optimize those health benefits and understanding the local characteristics of the population, understanding pollutant dispersion, for example, in the local area is all really important in order to design those schemes in that sense. Now, of course, there wasn't time for all of that, as we heard already. If you're putting in an ETO, there isn't time to do all of that. But ultimately, if we're thinking about schemes which optimize health benefits, then that's exactly what we need to be placing front and center.
And I think in the spirit of deliberative research, can I bring us back with the last question to Ella and the workshop? And I think following in the thread of sort of equity and benefits and trade-offs and how that all lies, did anyone in the workshops talk about the equity impact of displacing traffic from residential roads to main roads, which are usually still residential with less well-off residents? And if so, did anyone talk about their perceptions of the fairness of this or ways of mitigating negative impact for those living on main roads?
Yeah, that was definitely something that came up in some of the workshops. It was definitely a concern and something that people raised, that yeah, there would be again sort of particular groups of people who would be disproportionately impacted by the displacement onto those main roads, where there was already probably higher traffic and more congestion, and it was pushing more onto those roads, and it was seen as something that was a kind of inequitable outcome of some LTN measures. In terms of ways to mitigate this, I'm afraid I can't kind of think off the top of my head of any specific suggestions that people made to mitigate that impact specifically, but yeah, there may have been some suggestions.
Excellent, thank you very much. This brings us to a close for today. It is clear that the introduction of low traffic neighbourhoods should not be seen as one method of delivering reduced emissions, but as part of a wider package. And what we've heard today is that the route to implementation of low traffic neighbourhoods face some criticism, and there's a lot to consider. And this research has certainly shown some important consultation with the local public is. We've heard that low traffic neighbourhoods should be part of a wider toolkit in tackling climate change. And participants all agreed the needs to tackle the climate change emergency. And I'm pleased that we've been able to share with you some of the voices from our research on their views regarding low traffic neighbourhoods. We've heard some really insightful feedback on some of the alternative options available to supplement and complement low traffic neighbourhoods. New consultations and policy are expected later this year, and on local transport plans and active travel. And we've heard how low traffic neighbourhoods have affected marginalised communities. Much of the presentations and respondents echoed how we need to bring members of public on the journey, pardon the pun, towards active travel and taking action to reduce carbon emissions, but it needs to be well communicated and inclusive, and it doesn't sound like it ends there. We've also heard the call for more research evidence, and this will be important to ensure that local government can deliver benefits for both the local community and public health. And with that, I would very much like to thank all of our speakers, our respondents, Rocky, our research participant, and very much the audience for all of your engagement today. The report is available on NatSen's website. This event has been recorded and will be available on YouTube. And we do wish you a really pleasant evening. Thank you very much and goodbye.